It was a chilly Wednesday afternoon, and I remember it so vividly. I had been having trouble with the sink in my kitchen for a few weeks. The leak had started as just a small drip, but it quickly got worse. I didn't know what else to do, so I finally called a plumber to come and take a look. His name was Alex. I hadn't met him before, but I'd heard he was good at what he did, so I figured it would be a quick fix when he arrived. I opened the door, and I was a bit surprised. He was much younger than I expected, probably in his late 30s, early 40s, and handsome, too tall, strong beau with broad shoulders. I greeted him warmly and led him into the kitchen where the leak was. Now, I'll admit I had put on a nice robe that morning, nothing too revealing, just something light and comfortable. But when I saw the way Alex glanced at me for just a moment, I couldn't help but feel a little SP Park. As Alex got to work under the sink, I found myself standing nearby, just watching him. I don't know why, but there was something about him. Maybe it was the way he moved, so confident and sure of himself. Or maybe it was the fact that I hadn't had company in a while. Whatever it was, I could feel something stirring inside me. I started chatting with him, asking about his day, how long he'd been a plumber, things like that. He was polite, answering me without looking up too much, but I noticed that his voice was a bit nervous, almost like he was trying to focus on the job and not on me. It was cute, really. I couldn't help but smile. At one point, I reached out and touched his shoulder, just a light squeeze. It was innocent enough, but I could feel him stiffen under my hand. "You're really strong," I said, complimenting him, though I knew he was probably feeling a bit uneasy. He looked up at me a little startled, but I just gave him a soft smile. He shifted, trying to move away, but I wasn't ready to let him go just yet. I stepped a little closer, pretending to be interested in the work he was doing. "You need any help?" I asked, knowing full well that he didn't. I adjusted my robe just a little, letting it slip slightly off my shoulder. Alex didn't say anything, but I could see his face flush as he tried to focus on the pipes under the sink. I leaned down next to him, and as I did, my hand brushed against his arm. He tensed again, but I didn't pull away. There was a charge in the air now, something electric, and I knew he could feel it too. I stood up slowly, moving even closer to him. He was still crouched under the sink, doing his best to ignore the tension between us, but I wasn't about to let it go that easily. I waited until he stood up to gather his tools, and that's when I made my move. I leaned in close enough that he could feel my breath on his neck. "Is there anything else you could help me with?" I asked, my voice soft, but with a little edge to it. He looked at me, his eyes wide, but he didn't say anything. At first, I could tell he was trying to figure out how to respond. So I gave him a little nudge, literally. I let my hand slide down his arm, giving him just enough of a touch to make sure he understood where this was heading. And then, without waiting for him to answer, I leaned in and kissed him on the cheek. It wasn't bold, not at first, just a soft, gentle kiss, but I could feel him freeze up, and I knew I had crossed a line. He stood up quickly, almost knocking into the cabinets, and I could see the panic in his eyes. "Ma'am, I'm just here to fix the sink," he stammered, his voice shaking. I couldn't help but laugh softly. "Are you sure there's nothing else that needs fixing?" I asked, teasing him. Now, I stepped closer again, my lips just inches from his. I could see him trying to figure out what to do, whether he should stay or run. His hands were trembling as he tried to pack up his tools. "There's something else you could take care of for me?" I whispered, leaning in like I was about to kiss him again. But before I could, He took a step back, his hands up in front of him, like he was trying to ward me off. "I can't," he said, shaking his head. "I really can't." I pouted, feeling a little disappointed, but I knew he wasn't going to give in. He was flustered. Packing up his things as quickly as he could, I watched him go. Feeling a little thrill from the whole encounter, I didn't expect him to go that far, but it was fun pushing his buttons. Maybe next time, though. Who knows? I let him go that day. But there was something about the way he left. It wasn't just the awkwardness. There was a tension that hung in the air, and I knew that while Alex had said no, it wasn't because he wasn't interested. It was like he was holding himself back, caught between doing the right thing and giving in. I could see it in his eyes, the way he hesitated before leaving, like he wanted to stay, but didn't trust himself to handle the situation. Days went by, and I couldn't stop thinking about it every time I walked past the sink. I remembered how flustered he got when I touched his arm, the way his breathing changed. When I kissed him on the cheek, it was exciting. It had been a long time since I had felt something like that with anyone, especially someone younger. And to be honest, I didn't think I'd ever see him again. I figured he probably told himself he wouldn't come back after what happened. But then about a week later, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. But when I answered, it was Alex. "Hey, this is Alex, the plumber. I was just calling to check if everything's okay with the sink. Did the fix hold up?" His voice was polite, professional even, but I could hear the slight tremble beneath it. I smiled to myself. "Oh, Alex, how nice of you to call," I said, trying to keep my tone casual, though I knew exactly where this could go. Funny. You should ask. The sink is fine, but there's another issue in the bathroom I was hoping you could take a look at. It's probably nothing major, but I wouldn't feel right if I didn't have a professional check it out. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him weighing his options, deciding whether he should come back. "I can be there in about an hour," he said finally. When I hung up, I couldn't help but feel a little rush of excitement. This time, I had no intention of letting him off so easily. I knew he felt something, even if he was trying to ignore it, and I was determined to push things just a little further. This time, when Alex arrived, he was visibly more nervous than the first time. His usual confident demeanor was still there, but I could sense the hesitation as he stepped inside the bathroom. "Huh?" he asked, looking around like he was trying to focus on anything but me. I led him upstairs, and sure enough, there was a small issue with the faucet. It wasn't leaking, but the handle had become loose. He kneeled down to check it out. His focus entirely on the work this time, but I could tell he was more aware of my presence than ever. I stood just behind him, watching as he worked, but not saying anything. At first, the silence between us was heavy, thick, with unspoken tension. Finally, I couldn't resist any longer. "Alex," I said softly, "I've been thinking about you." He paused for a moment, his hand gripping the faucet a little tighter. "You have?" His voice was cautious, like he wasn't sure if he should acknowledge what had happened. Before, I haven't been able to stop thinking about what happened last time. I continued stepping a little closer. "You seemed interested, but you held back. Why was that?" He didn't answer at first, but I could see his knuckles turning white as he worked on the faucet. "It's just, I'm a professional," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wouldn't be right, wouldn't it?" I asked, moving so close now that I could practically feel the heat coming off him. "Who says what's right or wrong, Alex?" You're a grown man and I'm a grown woman. We both know there's something here, something between us. You can feel it, can't you? I watched him closely, waiting for his reaction. His breathing had quickened and his hand shook slightly as he finished tightening the handle on the faucet. He stood up, turning to face me, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He was trying so hard to stay professional, to keep that distance between us. But I knew he was struggling. You don't have to fight it, I whispered, stepping even closer, my hand lightly brushing against his chest. I could feel his heartbeat racing under my fingertips. No one has to know. It's just you and me here. He looked down at me, his jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might actually turn and leave again. But then, without warning, he reached out and grabbed my arm, pulling me towards him. It wasn't rough, but it was firm, and the suddenness of it took me by surprise. His face was inches from mine now, his breath warm against my skin. Margaret, he said, his voice low and intense, this isn't a game. I never said it was. I replied, my lips curling into a smile. I could feel the tension between us crackling like electricity. But it doesn't have to be complicated either. Sometimes you just need to let go. He hesitated for just a second longer, but then without another word, he leaned down and kissed me. It wasn't the hesitant peck on the cheek from last time. This was different. It was deep, passionate, like all the restraint he'd been holding on to had finally snapped. I kissed him back, my arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. For a few moments, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. There was only Alex, his hands gripping my waist, his lips on mine, and the heat between us that had been simmering for days. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing hard, and I could see in his eyes that there was no going back now. What now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I smiled and stepped back just enough to give him some space, but not too far. I think you know the answer to that, Alex. We've already crossed the line. Why stop now? He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. With one last glance at the door, he reached for me again, and this time there was no hesitation. No second thoughts this time. We were both fully in it, and neither of us was turning back. And let me tell you, the rest of that afternoon was, well, let's just say the bathroom wasn't the only thing that got fixed that day. That afternoon was something I hadn't experienced in a long time. As soon as Alex kissed me, all the tension, all the unspoken desire between us exploded into something neither of us could stop. He pulled me close, his hands tracing my back as his lips pressed against mine, more confident now, more intense. I could feel the weight of everything he had been holding back. We didn't even make it out of the bathroom. At first, he pushed me gently up against the wall, his hands everywhere, my shoulders, my waist, my hips. His touch was firm, but still respectful, like he was letting go of control, but didn't want to overstep. But I didn't mind. I didn't want him to hold back anymore. I wanted this just as much as he did. His lips moved from my mouth to my neck, and I let out a soft gasp. He paused, like he was checking to make sure I was okay with everything that was happening. When I didn't stop him, he continued his kisses, becoming more urgent, more needy. It was like all the time he'd spent denying this moment had built up into something neither of us could resist. But eventually, we did have to stop, if only to catch our breath. We stood there pressed together, both of us panting like we just run a marathon. His forehead rested against mine, and for a second, we were both silent, just taking in what had happened. I've never done anything like this. Alex murmured, his voice low and husky. I shouldn't have. I placed my hand on his chest, feeling his heart race beneath his shirt. There's nothing wrong with letting go. Sometimes, Alex, we're adults. We can do what we want. I smiled softly, trying to ease the guilt I could see creeping into his expression. He chuckled, but it was a nervous kind of laugh. You make it sound so simple. It is simple. I insisted, stepping back slightly, though I kept my hand on him. You've been holding back. Why? Because of some invisible line between what's right and wrong. Sometimes you just have to follow what feels good. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me with this intense, unreadable expression. Finally, he let out a long breath, like he was letting go of all the tension he'd been carrying. I guess I needed to hear that. The rest of the afternoon felt like a blur. After we'd both calmed down, I led him downstairs, and we sat together in the living room, talking in a way we hadn't. Before, the conversation wasn't forced or awkward like I'd worried it might be. Instead, we laughed, shared stories, and learned more about each other. Alex told me about his life, how he'd been working as a plumber for nearly 10 years after leaving a corporate job that he'd hated. He talked about how the routine work of fixing things had become something of a comfort for him, something he could control. It made sense in a way. He seemed like the kind of man who needed that structure, that stability. I told him about my own life too, about my marriage, how it had ended years ago, leaving me alone, but not bitter. I wasn't one of those women who carried regrets. I'd had a good life, but I'd been missing something for a long time. Companionship, passion. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but I needed to feel alive again. And Alex had given me that, even if just for an afternoon. As the sun began to set, I realized he had been here much longer than he'd planned. You should probably get going. I said, though part of me wanted him to stay. He hesitated, looking like he didn't want to leave. Yeah, I guess I should. But I don't want this to end awkwardly. I don't want you to think I was just, I shook my head, smiling at him. I don't. You're a good man, Alex. We both needed this, and I'm glad it happened, but I'm not expecting anything more than what this was. He looked relieved, though I could see there was still a bit of confusion in his eyes. Like he wasn't used to things being this straightforward. So you're really okay with everything? No weird feelings or anything? I laughed softly. No, Alex. No weird feelings. It was just one of those moments. No strings, no pressure. He nodded slowly, as if trying to process the simplicity of it all. Okay, he said, after a long pause. I guess I'll see you around, maybe. I said, teasing him a little. If my sink breaks again, you'll be the first one I call. That made him smile, and he stood up, grabbing his tools and slinging his bag over his shoulder. But before he left, he turned back to me. One last time. Margaret, I don't regret it. I just want you to know that I don't either. I replied softly, watching as he opened the door, and just like that, he was gone. I sat there for a while after he left, thinking about what had happened. It was one of those rare moments in life where everything lined up perfectly. No guilt, no shame, just two people letting go of their inhibitions for a little while in the days that followed. I thought about him occasionally. I wondered if he thought about me too, but I didn't call him back. I didn't need to. That afternoon had been exactly what it was meant to be. A moment of escape, a reminder that I was still very much alive, still capable of feeling excitement, desire, and spontaneity. And as for Alex, I hope he left feeling the same. Sometimes all it takes is one unexpected connection to make you realize that life doesn't have to be lived within the lines. Maybe he went back to his routine fixing pipes and working through his days like he always had, or maybe, just maybe, that afternoon gave him a little something extra, a new way of seeing things, a way of letting go when the moment was right. Whatever the case, I wouldn't forget him. And who knows, maybe the next time something breaks in this house, I'll call him, or maybe I'll just let fate decide. But for now, I'll cherish that little adventure for what it was. Something unexpected, something beautiful, and something that reminded me, even at 64, that life is still full of surprise